Welcome to today's historical deep dive, where we pull back the dusty curtains of the past to understand the minds that shaped worlds. Think of it as history under the covers, unraveling the grand narratives one quiet moment at a time. Today, we step into the mind of a man who bent Europe to his will, a force of nature in human form, Napoleon Bonaparte. His journey from obscure Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of the French is a story of ambition so vast it barely seems real, a tale of calculated genius intertwined with breathtaking arrogance. If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know, bringing these complex figures to light. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most about his life. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. It is the summer of 1812. You stand on the eastern bank of the River Niemen, a geographical artery separating your dominion from the untamed wildness of Russia. Before you, across the deceptively calm water, lies the vast, mysterious, and utterly defiant expanse of the Tsar's empire. It is a land of whispers and endless horizons, a place that has swallowed armies before. Behind you stretches the Grande Armée, not just an army, but a human tide, 500,000 souls strong, a colossal river of steel, flesh, and ambition winding back to the very edges of Europe. Eagles gleam in the sun, symbols of imperial power, reflecting the unblinking determination in your eyes. Drums beat a steady, hypnotic pulse, a primeval rhythm echoing the sheer scale of the force you command. The air vibrates not just with sound, but with the silent, terrifying power of the largest military force ever assembled under a single command in European history. You, Napoleon, feel the intoxicating thrill of this moment, the culmination of years of relentless conquest, meticulous calculation, and sheer, unadulterated will. You have taken a continent, shattered old empires, redrawn maps with the stroke of a pen and the thrust of a bayonet. Kings bow to you, emperors seek your favor, and now only Tsar Alexander I stands truly independent, a stubborn, irritating thorn in the side of your continental system. That grand design to bring Britain to its knees through economic strangulation. He challenges your absolute dominance, and your pride, that ever-present companion, demands this final, decisive stroke. Your strategic vision is crystal clear. Russia will be forced into line, completing the blockade against perfidious Albion, solidifying your reign as absolute master of the continent. But here, on the edge of this abyss, the sheer audacity of it all takes your breath away, and perhaps, just perhaps, blinds you slightly to the immense, unforeseen dangers lurking beyond that seemingly placid river. This is the peak, the zenith of your earthly power, the moment ambition takes its grandest, most perilous leap, believing size and will alone can conquer geography, climate, and stubborn, scorched earth resistance. Did you truly believe 500,000 men, representing a dozen nations, could march hundreds of miles into a hostile void and emerge victorious? The sheer logistical nightmare was enough to make seasoned quartermasters weep. Supplying such a host was a feat almost unimaginable, requiring meticulous planning that often dissolved into chaos on the march. Ask yourself, was this unparalleled brilliance pushing the boundaries of what was possible? Or was it hubris, the intoxicating belief that you were simply invincible? The Grande Armée flows across the Niemen, not in a disciplined surge, but a vast, sprawling, multinational river. The men are not all French. They are Germans, Italians, Poles, Swiss, Austrians, compelled into your service, their loyalty a fragile veneer over simmering resentments and alien tongues. This diversity, a testament to your vast empire, also breeds chaos. Commands are misunderstood, supplies are pilfered, discipline frays under the sheer weight of numbers and the alien landscape. Immediately, the expected clash of armies fails to materialize. The Russians retreat, a phantom force melting away, leaving behind not battlefields but emptiness. They burn their villages, their crops, deny you sustenance and shelter. They turn their own land into a weapon, vastness and desolation replacing pitched battles you craved. You push deeper, expecting them to turn and fight, expecting them to protect Moscow, their sacred heart. But they withdraw, dragging you further into the immense, unforgiving interior. Your supply lines stretch thinner than thread, vulnerable to Cossack raids and simple attrition. The wagons carrying food, forage, and ammunition struggle on primitive roads, breaking down or falling behind. Men begin to starve. Horses die in their thousands, collapsing from exhaustion and lack of fodder. This wasn't the glorious, swift campaign you envisioned, a replay of Austerlitz or Friedland. This was a grinding, debilitating slog against an enemy who refused to fight on your terms, an enemy using time and space as their greatest allies. You make the decision to push on, convinced that taking Moscow will force the Tsar's hand. It is a gamble born of frustration and a deep-seated belief in your own destiny. You cannot afford to winter in the desolate plains. Your army, already bleeding from lack of supplies and the demoralizing retreat of the enemy. You must force a confrontation, a decisive battle that will break their will. But as you advance, you discover a harsh truth often obscured by the glory of battle. An army marches on its stomach, and your stomach is empty. The logistics, the mundane, back-breaking reality of warfare begin to assert their dominance over your strategic brilliance. The sheer scale of the invasion, once your greatest strength, becomes your most profound weakness. What would you have done? Standing in his boots, seeing your invincible army begin to fray, not from enemy action, but from the sheer emptiness of the land. Was there a point of no return somewhere back near the Niemen? A moment when ambition blinded you to the impossible geometry of conquering a continent? The dust rises from the endless road, the sun beats down, and with each passing mile into the Russian heartland, the shadow of unforeseen dangers lengthens. As the first flakes of snow begin to fall, dusting the blackened ruins of the Russian countryside, the truth settles in with an icy grip. Moscow, the prize for which you sacrificed so much, has yielded no surrender, no peace. The city itself was a pyre, set ablaze by the retreating Russians, denying you shelter and sustenance for your weary army. Your gamble failed. The Tsar refused to negotiate, buoyed by the sheer distances, the harsh climate, and the knowledge that time was his greatest ally. Now the elements, previously a distant threat, become a palpable enemy. The Russian winter, a force more formidable than any army, descends with brutal speed. The retreat begins, a mirror image of the triumphant advance, but twisted into a nightmare. Order dissolves as the cold bites deeper than any bayonet. Soldiers, weakened by starvation and exhaustion, huddle together for warmth, their once proud uniforms becoming rags against the wind. The roads, already treacherous, turn into icy death traps. Horses slip and fall, Wagons overturn, scattering precious supplies. Discipline evaporates, replaced by a primal urge for survival. The Cossacks, the phantom cavalry that harried your flanks during the advance, now swarm the ragged columns, picking off stragglers, preying on the weak. The rivers, crossed with such fanfare months ago, become frozen barriers of death, particularly the infamous crossing of the Berezina, where thousands drowned or were left behind in the chaotic, desperate rush to escape. This retreat was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a disintegration, a slow, agonizing death march across a frozen wasteland. The Grande Armée, the symbol of your absolute power, ceases to exist as a cohesive fighting force. It becomes a starving, freezing mob, haunted by the ghosts of its former glory. You, Napoleon, leave the army behind, racing back to Paris to raise a new one, a decision viewed by many as abandonment, though perhaps a necessary one to preserve your throne. But the psychological blow is immense. The myth of your invincibility shatters like ice underfoot. You underestimated not just the Russian army, but the Russian land, the Russian winter, and the unwavering resolve of a people defending their home. The Grande Armée, 500,000 strong, melts away, leaving behind only corpses, broken equipment, and a legend of catastrophic failure. It is a stark lesson in the limits of even the most formidable human will when pitted against the unforgiving forces of nature and the stubborn resilience of a determined foe. You conquered kings and empires, but you could not conquer winter, distance, and ashes. In the end, the story of Napoleon, particularly the stark, unforgiving narrative of 1812, offers profound, timeless lessons that echo far beyond the battlefields and opulent palaces. It teaches us about the intoxicating yet often blinding nature of ambition. From the banks of the Niemen, where boundless confidence propelled 500,000 men into the unknown, to the frozen plains of the retreat, we see the tragic arc of a man who pushed the limits of possibility, only to be broken by the fundamental realities he chose to ignore. The big lesson here isn't just about military strategy. It's about the crucial difference between calculated risk and sheer overreach, between visionary leadership and fatal hubris. It reminds us that power, however absolute it may seem, is always subject to constraints, geography, logistics, the will of others, and the unpredictable fury of nature itself. When we study history honestly, we gain not just knowledge of past events, but a deeper wisdom about the human condition. Napoleon's downfall in Russia illuminates the dangers of surrounding oneself with sycophants who fail to challenge your assumptions, the peril of underestimating your opponent's willingness to suffer, and the simple, brutal truth that logistics can be a more decisive factor than genius on the battlefield. His legacy is a complex tapestry of revolutionary reform, tyrannical control, military brilliance, and devastating failure. It compels us to reflect on the nature of leadership, the corrupting influence of absolute power, and the enduring human capacity for both extraordinary achievement and catastrophic self-destruction. He chased a vision of a unified, French-dominated Europe, and in doing so, unleashed forces he ultimately could not control. His story is a vivid, often terrifying, illustration of how quickly the pinnacle of power can crumble when built upon the shifting sands of arrogance and the disregard for inconvenient truths. In the end, It wasn't just the Russian army or the brutal winter that defeated him. It was believing he was exempt from the fundamental laws that govern men and empires. The air chills, not just with anticipation, but with the grim logic of a system you yourself created. You stand surveying the maps, your empire a vast interconnected web stretching across the continent, each thread pulled taut by your will. This wasn't supposed to happen. The invasion of Russia, this colossal gamble, wasn't born of sudden impulse or battlefield fever. It was the chilling, almost predictable, consequence of the cage you built. The continental system. You conceived it as the ultimate weapon against Britain, your persistent nemesis across the Channel. An economic iron fist designed to strangle their trade, isolate them, force them to their knees without firing a single shot across the water. For it to work, it demanded absolute, suffocating adherence. Every port sealed, every nation compliant. Europe became your closed shop, and any independent transaction with London was a direct assault on your grand strategy. Tsar Alexander I, across the frozen plains, understood this. He was part of the system, bound by treaty. But his commitment was lukewarm, his economy bleeding under the blockade. He saw British trade as a lifeline, a necessity for his vast, underdeveloped realm. You saw his continued commerce not as a pragmatic economic choice, but as a blatant act of defiance. It wasn't just a policy disagreement. It felt like a personal betrayal, a gaping hole torn in the very fabric of the economic wall you had meticulously, brutally constructed. You couldn't abide it. Dissent wasn't an option. A breach in the wall was intolerable. The magnificent structure of your unified Europe, built on military might and enforced economic isolation, couldn't have a single weak point, a single nation marching to a different drum. His independence was a contagion you had to eliminate before it spread. The invasion was conceived not as a war of conquest in the traditional sense, but a punitive expedition, a demonstration of absolute authority. Force Alexander back into line, shatter his independence, perhaps even replace him with a more compliant ruler. Reassert your unchallengeable dominion over the entirety of the European chessboard. It was the logical, terrifying culmination of your totalizing vision, the belief that every piece, every nation, every ruler on the continent must move precisely as you dictated. Anything less was chaos, a challenge to your genius, a flaw in the masterpiece. And you, Napoleon, could not tolerate flaws. This wasn't madness. It was the extreme, inherent risk of a system demanding total conformity. Ask yourself, was this strategic necessity dictated by the architecture of your own empire, or the fatal flaw of a man who believed his control must be absolute, even unto the gates of Moscow? Across the wide, gray ribbon of the Niemen River they flow. 600,000 men, French veterans, Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch, Swiss, a dozen other flags snapping under your golden eagles. This isn't just an army, it's a continent in miniature, bound by a single, all-consuming will, yours. It is the most formidable instrument of war the world has ever witnessed, a breathtaking testament to your logistical genius, your capacity to organize chaos on an unimaginable scale. But this magnificent machine is also fueled by something less tangible, more potent, the potent myth of your invincibility. Memories of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, aren't just victories. They are prophecies etched into the minds of every soldier, every general, every nation you command. They echo loudest in your own mind. How could any force on earth, least of all the sprawling, unpredictable, seemingly backward Russian army, possibly stand against this tide? You watch them cross, the sun glinting off bayonets, stretching to the horizon, and feel a serene, fatal certainty. This belief in your own unstoppable momentum, forged in a decade of relentless, impossible successes, becomes a dangerous, distorting lens. Through it, you view the immense challenge ahead not as a perilous gamble, but as the next inevitable step in your relentless ascent. You see maps, not mud and distance. You see armies to be outmaneuvered, not a population prepared to sacrifice everything, including their own cities. You see objectives, not the brutal, indifferent vastness of a land that devours invaders whole. The greatest risk is not the Cossack cavalry or the Russian cannons. It is the internal conviction that you are immune to failure, that reality itself bends to the force of your will. This is the insidious trap of sustained absolute power, the gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of humility, replaced by this quiet, devastating certainty. You have become the embodiment of the empire's strength, and in doing so, have inherited its blindness. Ask yourself, is this still strategic calculation, or has ambition finally crossed the Rubicon into self-deception? The answer, as the columns disappear into the eastern forests, feels chillingly clear. Days bleed into weeks, then months, under an indifferent sun that bakes the roads to dust, or rains that turn them into quagmires. The Grande Armée, this magnificent engine built for swift, decisive victory, pushes deeper into the vast, silent interior of Russia. You expected battles, grand clashes on the scale of Austerlitz or Friedland, where strategy and will could impose order and force a conclusion. But no such battle materializes. Instead, you march across an endless horizon, a country that refuses to offer a firm target. Villages are deserted, houses burned to their foundations by the retreating Cossacks, leaving behind only the stench of smoke and loss. The land itself is a monstrous, formless enemy, vast beyond comprehension, swallowing units and hopes in its sheer scale. This is not the compact chessboard of Central Europe. This is a different game entirely, played across a canvas too large for even your strategic genius to master. Your meticulously planned supply lines, stretching back hundreds upon hundreds of miles to the Niemen River, begin to fray. The threads holding the army together snap one by one. Wagons, overloaded and traversing brutal tracks, break down and are abandoned, precious food and ammunition left behind. Horses, the lifeblood of cavalry and transport, die in droves from lack of forage as the Russians strip the land ahead of you. Dysentery, fever, and sheer exhaustion claim men before they ever see a major engagement. You watch veterans, hardened by a dozen campaigns, stumble and fall, victims not of cannon fire, but of thirst, hunger, and the relentless, soul-crushing march. The enemy retreats, always just out of reach, pulling you further and further from your base, forcing you to consume the desolate land as you go. The promised quick victory, the grand confrontation that would break Russia's will, dissolves into a grinding, attritional struggle against geography itself. You learn, too late, that while ambition can push men and redraw maps on paper, it cannot shrink distances or conjure supplies out of thin air. The sheer, brutal reality of Russia's space is a lesson delivered not by armies, but by empty stomachs and endless roads. Ask yourself, was this relentless push forward still strategy? Or had it become an act of desperate faith against the undeniable facts on the ground? You finally approach Smolensk. It is a major city, a true prize. Anticipation surges through the ranks, and through you. This is it, the chance you've been waiting for. You envision the grand battle, the climactic confrontation, where you corner the main Russian army, deal them a decisive blow, and force them to surrender or be annihilated. This is the Napoleonic method at its finest. Find the enemy, fight, destroy. Smolensk feels like the perfect stage for this long-awaited drama. The fighting, when it comes, is indeed fierce. Your soldiers, though weary, fight with the desperate hope that this is the beginning of the end. They push forward, overcoming desperate resistance, and the city eventually falls. You stand victorious amidst the smoke and rubble. But as the dust settles, the familiar, bitter taste of disappointment returns. The enemy has slipped away again. The main Russian army, your primary objective, is gone, leaving behind not a routed foe, but smoldering ruins and empty streets. The tactical victory, the taking of Smolensk, feels hollow, unsatisfying. The grand battle you sought never truly materialized. Your troops are exhausted, their morale chipped away by this endless pursuit of an enemy who refuses to stand and fight on your terms. Your resources, already stretched thin across the vast, unforgiving plains, are further depleted by the cost of taking a city that holds no strategic leverage over the enemy's main force. You stand amidst the wreckage, the smell of smoke and death heavy in the oppressive summer air. A chilling realization begins to dawn, a creeping dread that settles deep in your gut. You are winning battles, yes, achieving tactical successes in each skirmish, but you are losing the campaign. The enemy isn't fighting by your rules, the rules of decisive battles and conquered capitals that have defined your career. They are trading space, vast, almost infinite space in this colossal land, for time, a resource you are rapidly running out of with each passing league, while they have it in seemingly endless supply. This is the moment you confront the fundamental limitations of pure military force when applied against an opponent who refuses to engage in the traditional duel. Your hammer blows land not on a solid shield, but on mist. Every step forward costs you men, supplies, and time, while costing the enemy little, but land they can afford to lose. Smolensk, the supposed turning point, becomes a stark, brutal lesson in strategic humility. What does this moment reveal about the limits of even the most brilliant generalship when facing a truly unconventional strategy? Ask yourself, at this juncture, were you still the master of events, or a magnificent engine driving inexorably towards an unseen precipice? The columns stretch into the hazy distance, a river of men and horses flowing eastward under a sun that bakes the parched earth one day and disappears into a chilling, relentless rain the next. This isn't the swift, glorious advance of Jena or Austerlitz. This is a grinding, endless shuffle, a march that feels less like a conquest and more like a pilgrimage to some punishing, distant altar. You ride alongside, or sometimes ahead, observing the transformation of the Grande Armée. The uniforms, once crisp, are now ragged. The quick step is replaced by a weary shuffle. The boisterous singing has faded into a grim silence, broken only by the creak of wagons and the rhythmic thud of thousands of tired feet. Moscow. It has become more than a strategic objective. It is an obsession, a point on the map magnified into a psychological anchor, a necessary destination to justify the immense cost already paid. The initial strategic vision, to force a decisive battle early on, evaporated like morning mist. The Russians retreated, burning the land, pulling you deeper into their vast, unforgiving territory. And with each step, the strain increases. Discipline, the steel frame of your army, begins to show hairline fractures. Supplies dwindle. Promised stocks fail to materialize or are consumed faster than they can be brought up. The soldiers, hungry and frustrated, begin to forage aggressively, brutally. They raid villages, seize livestock, alienate the very population you hoped might see you as liberators from the Tsar. This isn't sanctioned requisition. It's desperation turning into lawless plundering. You see it in their eyes as you ride past, a blend of exhaustion, disillusionment, and resentment. The bond, forged in shared victories and hardships, on shorter, swifter campaigns, is fraying under the strain of this seemingly endless hardship. You remember the cheers, the absolute trust, the willingness to follow you anywhere. Now, there are just tired, questioning stares. The invincible Grande Armée, the instrument of your will that reshaped Europe, is not being broken by cannon fire on a battlefield. It is dissolving, molecule by molecule, in the crucible of mud, hunger, and psychological fatigue. Intellectually, you understand the mounting costs. Each deserted farm, each emaciated horse, each soldier falling to sickness or exhaustion is a chip away from your power. You receive reports, grim tallies of stragglers, deserters, losses to disease. You see the empty spaces in the ranks. The strategic calculation screams retreat, screams caution, screams that this deep penetration is a trap. But the pull of Moscow is overwhelming. It sits there, a symbol of ultimate victory, a prize that must be attained to justify the sacrifices. To turn back now, before reaching it, would feel like admitting defeat, not to the enemy's army, but to the vastness of the land and the resilience of their retreat. It would be an unbearable humiliation. You are chasing a phantom, driven less by strategic logic and more by the need to validate the immense debt of suffering and resources already incurred. It's the gambler's fallacy writ large across a continent. You've put so much in. You have to keep going to win it all back. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The army built on speed and decisive battle is being consumed by a march that achieves neither. Ask yourself, at what point does ambition cease to be strategic drive and become self-destructive obsession? What would you have done, standing in his boots, seeing your greatest creation dissolving around you, with the symbol of victory just over the horizon, but shrouded in mist? You press on, towards the spire of the Kremlin, pulled by a force you can no longer control, even as the foundation beneath you crumbles. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and anticipation. For miles, the landscape is a tapestry of flickering campfires, each one a tiny beacon marking the position of a small knot of men, men who will either live or die with the rising sun. Finally, the Russians have turned to fight, their lines drawn before a village called Borodino. You walk among your soldiers this night, a lone figure moving through a sea of humanity poised on the brink. The usual boisterous camp sounds are muted, replaced by a low, pervasive murmur, the sound of 500,000 souls contemplating the dawn, of steel being sharpened against stone, of hushed prayers whispered into the cold air. You see the faces as you pass, not just the eager, youthful glint of glory seekers, but the grim, weary determination etched into older features, the quiet acceptance of terrible odds. These are the men who have marched across a continent for you. For France, for an idea of empire. You know this will be the battle you craved, the massive, decisive clash of armies that could break the enemy's will and pave your path to Moscow. Yet, looking into their eyes, the abstract goals of conquest and glory condense into the brutal human cost. Each life is a weight, a responsibility you carry alone in this moment. Before the main assault, you issue a stirring proclamation, a torrent of words designed to ignite the spirit, to remind them of past victories at Austerlitz, at Friedland, of the glory that awaits, of France, of their homes. The cheers rise, a momentary wave of defiance against the fear of dawn. Outwardly, you are the confident emperor, the architect of victory. But inwardly, you feel the immense, almost crushing weight of every single life you are about to commit to the maw of battle. This is the stark reality beneath the gilded uniform and the strategic maps. Leadership isn't just the brilliant deployment of corps and cannons. It is the profound moral burden of command. The lives held precariously in your hands, their fates hanging on your decisions. Consider this moment. Is the pursuit of grand ambition ever worth such a burden? What would it feel like knowing that by sunrise, thousands of the faces you see tonight will be gone forever? It's a sobering clarity rarely captured in the portraits, a moment where the conqueror confronts the true price of conquest. The eastern sky bleeds crimson, not with dawn, but with the reflection of cannon fire. A low rumble grows into a deafening roar as the grandest battlefield of the campaign unfolds before you. Borodino. It is not a battle, it is a forge where armies are hammered into dust. The air is thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, a smell you know too well, but never on this scale. Columns of men march forward into a storm of grapeshot. Infantry squares become islands in a red sea of charging cavalry, only to see the waves break against their bayonets. Redoubts, strategic mounds of earth and wood, are fought over with suicidal fury, changing hands multiple times throughout the endless hours. Each yard gained is paid for in lives, a horrifying transaction witnessed by a merciless sun. You are the architect of this maelstrom. You commit your precious reserves, the Imperial Guard held back for so long, finally unleashing their disciplined power into the chaos. You send urgent dispatches, pushing your corps commanders, demanding relentless pressure, demanding victory. Your energy is boundless, a desperate, fiery resolve mirroring the conflagration devouring the landscape. You ride near the lines, a magnet for danger, fueled by the singular need to break this stubborn Russian resistance. The hours crawl by, each one a lifetime of death and suffering. The ground beneath your feet trembles with the concussions of thousands of guns. By nightfall, the battlefield is a charnel house. The firing slackens, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the eerie silence of the dead. The field is yours, yes. The Russian army has retreated, abandoning the ground. You have won, a technical triumph etched in blood and mud. But the victory tastes like ash. Tens of thousands lie dead or maimed. 70,000 men, perhaps more, scattered like fallen leaves across 20 square miles. It is the single bloodiest day any European battlefield has ever witnessed. You survey the carnage, the title Lion of Borodino echoing hollowly in the devastation. This was not the crushing, annihilating victory you desperately needed. The Russian army, though battered, is not destroyed. It has merely withdrawn, its core strength, its will to fight another day, frustratingly intact. Your own army, however, is bled white, its veteran ranks decimated. This Pyrrhic truth settles heavy on your shoulders. A victory won at such a ruinous cost is, in reality, a profound defeat. It did not break Russia, it broke you. Consider this: Napoleon's refusal to commit the Guard earlier is debated endlessly, but his final push, securing the field at this cost, was his decision. Was this a calculated risk that miscarried, or the tragic consequence of an enemy refusing to play by the expected rules of war? Ask yourself, when does the price of winning become too high, transforming triumph into tragedy? You ride through the ancient gates, a conqueror entering the heart of a defiant empire. Expectation hangs thick in the air, a heady perfume of victory after the blood and thunder of Borodino. You anticipate crowds lining the streets, perhaps fearful, perhaps awed, but present. You look for the city fathers, the boyars in their ceremonial robes, ready to prostrate themselves, keys offered, a symbolic surrender of the Tsar's ancient capital. This is the predictable script, the historical precedent for claiming such a prize. But the city does not play its part. As you advance, kilometer by kilometer, a chilling silence descends. The streets are eerily deserted. The magnificent houses stand empty, their windows like vacant eyes. Shops are shuttered. Grand squares lie still. It's not just empty. It feels abandoned. The inhabitants haven't surrendered. They've vanished, taking with them everything of value, leaving behind only the hollow shells of their lives and fortunes. This is not the surrender you envisioned. It is an indictment. Moscow, the ancient, sacred heart, has refused to be conquered in the traditional sense. It offers no delegations, no pleas for peace, no symbolic defeat. It offers only this unnerving, profound emptiness. You take up residence in the Kremlin, the historic citadel, surrounded by the silent, empty grandeur of its palaces and cathedrals. You are physically in Moscow. You have occupied the geographical objective you marched so far to attain. But the strategic goal, forcing the Tsar's hand, compelling peace on your terms, ending the war swiftly and decisively, remains as distant, perhaps even more distant, than it was before Borodino. The prize is in your hand, but it feels strangely worthless. A stunningly beautiful, elaborate box revealed to be utterly hollow inside. This is the cruel, bitter irony. Achieving a superficial target with monumental effort, only to find it brings you no closer to the fundamental purpose. Sometimes, the greatest victory is recognizing that the sought-after prize isn't the true measure of success, especially when its attainment leaves you strategically exposed deep in hostile territory, facing an enemy who refuses to acknowledge your victory. What do you do now, sitting in the silence of the Kremlin? The expectation was surrender, negotiations, resolution. The reality is a phantom city and an unseen enemy somewhere beyond the horizon, playing a game you didn't anticipate. This moment in Moscow is not a triumph. It is a strategic void. It demands not celebration, but a desperate reckoning. You have seized the city, but you have lost the initiative. Ask yourself, what does it mean to conquer a ghost? Is this the peak of your power, or the first step into the abyss? Then, the fires begin, not the controlled hearth-like glows of a conquered city settling into uneasy occupation. No, these are tendrils of smoke, rising from the city's timber heart, tentative at first, then bolder, greedier. They catch the wind, a cruel ally in this moment, and explode into an inferno. The sight is apocalyptic. Moscow burns. It doesn't just burn, it rages, a sea of crimson and gold, consuming everything in its path. Districts vanish into the conflagration, the sounds of collapsing buildings and crackling wood echoing across the plains. For days, the sky is stained with its fury, visible from miles around, a horrifying beacon advertising your conquest. Whether ignited by retreating Russians, a desperate scorched earth tactic, or by the chaotic accidents inherent in a city emptied of its masters and filled with foreign troops, the effect is devastatingly the same. The immediate victory tastes like ash. Your army, positioned to finally rest and resupply within Moscow's walls, is forced out, sheltering in the surrounding fields and charred suburbs. The immense stores of food, forage, and shelter you desperately needed to survive the coming winter, all turned to smoke and cinders. The city itself, your grand prize, your bargaining chip against Tsar Alexander, is gone. What leverage do you have over ruins? You stand watching it, perhaps from a hill nearby, perhaps from the Petrovsky Palace you retreated to. The heat felt even at a distance. This wasn't in the plan. The enemy didn't meet your army and break. They yielded the city, leaving you to find not a resource-rich capital, but a self-immolating trap. The strategic objective dissolves before your eyes. You sought control of a city, control of a campaign, control of a czar's will. But in Moscow, you controlled nothing but the right to stand among smoldering debris. A stunning, perhaps even darkly witty countermove by Kutuzov, or fate itself. He didn't need to beat you. He just needed to deny you sanctuary and let the Russian winter, and Russia's refusal to yield, do the rest. It's a chilling lesson. Control isn't just about possession. It's about the conditions of its use. And here, those conditions were utterly hostile, orchestrated by a foe who understood that time and desolation were more potent weapons than muskets and cannonballs. You've won the city, but lost the war's trajectory in the process. Ask yourself, was the capture of Moscow brilliance, or was it merely a walk into a cage you didn't see being built? What would you feel, watching your hard-won prize dissolve into smoke and knowing the long road home lay before you? Stripped bare, you linger in the ashes of Moscow. The great city burns, a pyre consuming itself. But a strange, unsettling quiet settles over your army. For 5 precious weeks, you play a waiting game. It is a game you believe you have already won. You send messengers across the desolate landscape, emissaries carrying your terms, your expectations. You anticipate the familiar pattern, the enemy leader facing the inevitable might of your presence, cracking under the pressure, suing for peace, ceding territory, bending the knee. Others have done it. Why not Tsar Alexander? Your reputation precedes you, a storm of invincibility that has swept across Europe. Surely, the weight of this legacy, the mere fact that you are in his ancient capital, must force his hand. You believe in the power of your will, forged in countless victories, tested in the crucible of revolution and empire. You expect him to yield, to accept the reality of your triumph and minimize his losses. But Alexander remains silent. The weeks stretch into an agonizing eternity of inaction. There is no reply, no emissary seeking yours, no hint of negotiation. He is distant, implacable, shrouded in the vastness of his own domain. You wait in the charred remains of a city you expected to conquer, yet feel increasingly trapped within. The air grows colder, a biting wind whipping through the skeletal buildings. The leaves turn, wither, fall. This is the moment where ambition blinds foresight. You refuse to acknowledge the fundamental shift in your position. You are not dictating terms from a position of strength and easy supply lines. You are deep in hostile territory, your army frayed, its resources dwindling daily. Your clinging to the hope that your mere name would force a surrender is a fatal delusion. Every day you linger, waiting for a response that will never come, is a day closer to the deadly embrace of the Russian winter. It is a day further depleting the meager stores your men desperately need. It is a day hardening the resolve of your enemy, showing them that you too have a breaking point, a vulnerability. This isn't the rapid, decisive campaign that defined your earlier years. This is a slow bleed, a passive defeat inflicted by inaction. The surprising detail, the deeper insight here, is that Alexander wasn't just stubborn. He understood something you, in your pride, momentarily forgot. Sometimes, the greatest strength is patience, and the most formidable weapon is endurance. He knew the true ally on his side was not an army, but the unforgiving immensity and climate of Russia itself. While you waited in gilded halls turned to ash, time worked relentlessly against you. Ask yourself, was this prolonged wait, this refusal to acknowledge the stark reality of your circumstances, a final, desperate gamble born of hubris? Or was it a tragic miscalculation, a moment where the strategic genius that defined you simply failed to adapt to an enemy who refused to play by the old rules? What would you have done, standing in his boots, feeling the chill seep into your bones, knowing the enemy was not just across the field, but in the very air you breathed, the ground you stood upon? Pride kept you anchored to the ruins of Moscow, expecting the world to bend, as it always had. Humility, the painful admission that this time was different, that retreat was the only viable action, would have saved you countless lives and preserved the core of your power. The greatest battles are often not lost in the roar of cannons, but in the silent, internal struggle of a leader failing to act when action is most critically needed. This waiting game was not just a delay. It was a surrender to circumstance, a fatal pause that allowed the true enemy, winter and distance, to close in. As the first snow begins to fall, dusting the scarred streets and the gilded domes of Moscow, the harsh truth finally penetrates the illusion of victory. You stand inside the Kremlin, surrounded by relics of a conquered capital. But the chill in the air is not merely the coming winter. It is the icy hand of reality closing around your grand design. You cannot stay. The city is empty of the peace you sought, and the vast, silent land outside is preparing to become your tomb. Retreat is the only option, a bitter pill to swallow after proclaiming victory by taking Moscow, after months of relentless advance. The weight of that decision settles upon you, heavier than any crown. To turn back is to admit the grandest gamble has failed, not by an enemy army in open battle, but by the sheer, unforgiving scale of Russia itself. The route back is long, through territory already ravaged by the advance. Under skies that promise a bitterness you have never truly known, morale, buoyed precariously by the occupation, plummets like a stone thrown into a frozen well. The orderly, magnificent Grand Army of the invasion, that titan that strode across Europe, becomes before your eyes a shuffling, ragged column of increasingly desperate men. The fine uniforms fray, the boots wear thin, and the proud banners sag in the wind. This will be a test of endurance unlike any other you have faced. Not against cannons and cavalry, but against hunger, frost, and the slow erosion of hope. The strategic failure, the miscalculation of Russia's willingness to fight, and the season's timeline is now a tactical nightmare of survival on an epic, horrifying scale. Every step back feels like a retreat from destiny itself. The decision to turn back is the hardest you have ever made, an admission that your ambition, for the first time, collided head-on with an obstacle it could not simply overcome or outmaneuver. It's a stark, brutal lesson. Leadership isn't just about advancing, about conquering new ground and dictating terms. It is also, perhaps more profoundly, about knowing when and how to withdraw. It is about the chilling calculus of preserving what remains, giving the hardest order to save a remnant from total annihilation. You are not just leading an army now. You are presiding over an exodus, a forced march away from a dream turned nightmare. The true cost of Moscow is not measured in captured flags, but in the lives you must now try to drag back across the frozen plains. Ask yourself, is this the moment the unconquerable leader learned the limits of his own will, or the first step in a long, agonizing fall? What would you have done, standing in his boots, watching the first snowflakes erase the path you came from? The march back begins, and it will redefine everything you thought you knew about victory and defeat. The biting air is no longer just cold, it is an active assailant. You breathe it in, and it sears your lungs, a sharp, agonizing invasion. The snow, which began as a dusting, now blankets the world in an indifferent, suffocating white, hiding the treacherous ice beneath, swallowing the fallen. Roads vanish, landmarks disappear under drifts that rise like frozen waves. You watch, helpless, as the carefully constructed order of the Grande Armée begins to unravel, not under enemy fire, but under the relentless, silent assault of temperature and wind. The mercury plummets with horrifying speed, dropping far below the point where human survival is anything but a desperate, moment-to-moment struggle. Uniforms, once symbols of pride and power, offer pitifully little protection against the Siberian chill that penetrates cloth and flesh alike, seeping into bones, numbing minds, turning thought into a slow, agonizing process. Every step becomes a battle against the elements, a fight against the ground that resists. The air that bites, the cold that drains life with invisible efficiency. Horses, the engines of this vast military machine, die by the thousand, collapsing in steaming heaps on the snow, their muscles failing, their blood thickening in their veins. With the horses gone, artillery pieces, those thunderous voices of victory, become useless anchors, abandoned alongside the wagons that carry the meager, dwindling supplies. The grand symbols of military might are rendered impotent, pathetic husks against the vast white expanse. Hunger is a constant, gnawing presence, a deeper cold that hollows you from the inside. Discipline dissolves as men, driven by the primal need to survive, scavenge desperately, abandoning their ranks, their loyalty, even their humanity in the face of this elemental siege. They huddle together, a mass of shivering misery, finding meager warmth in proximity, their eyes reflecting only the stark, terrifying reality of their predicament. The once feared soldiers of the emperor are reduced to frightened animals, fighting not an army, but the very air they breathe. This is not war as Napoleon knew it, a grand chess match of strategy and maneuver. This is a different kind of enemy entirely, a force that feels nothing, has no flank to turn, no supply lines to cut, no will to break. The Russian winter cares nothing for eagles, or empires, or the ambitions of men. It is a stark, brutal reminder that ultimate power does not reside in crowns or cannons, but in the indifferent, chaotic forces of nature. Ask yourself, was this the moment the emperor truly understood the limits of his dominion, or had he already sealed his fate by daring to challenge a force far greater than any human army? This landscape of frozen death is the brutal consequence of believing that even the seasons could bend to the will of the world's most powerful man. The snow falls relentlessly, a shroud over the retreating columns. Your magnificent Grande Armée, once a vibrant ribbon of power stretching across Europe, is now a ragged, stumbling line of ghosts. This isn't just a march, it's an unraveling, a slow, agonizing decay witnessed step by frozen step. And the enemy isn't always visible. Out of the swirling mist, from behind snow-laden trees, they appear, the Cossacks, phantom-like figures on their hardy ponies. They strike without warning. They don't engage in grand battles. Their war is one of attrition, of terror. They are the wolves nipping at the heels of a dying beast. They harass the flanks, appearing suddenly, slashing with sabers, capturing the slow, the weak, the stragglers who can no longer keep pace with the desperate shuffle forward. Then, just as quickly, they vanish back into the white expanse, leaving behind only fear and depleted ranks. This constant, unnerving presence drains morale as surely as hunger drains strength. You cannot bring your artillery to bear on shadows, cannot outmaneuver an enemy that refuses to stand and fight on your terms. It's a chilling reminder that the most frustrating opponent is often the one who refuses to play by your rules. Compounding the agony is the utter lack of supply. The carefully planned logistical chain, designed for a rapid advance and occupation, collapsed weeks ago. Now, the only hope for food lies off the road, in devastated villages or buried under the snow. This forces foraging parties, groups of desperate men sent out to find sustenance. But sending men away from the main column is a death sentence. They are isolated, easy prey for those same lurking Cossacks, or simply swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. Each missing party is another bite taken out of the army's dwindling flesh, a slow bleeding that cannot be stopped. You see men volunteer out of desperation, a desperate gamble against crushing odds, knowing they might never return. And this is where the true disintegration begins. It's not just the cold that kills, or the hunger that gnaws. It's the shattering of cohesion, the breakdown of discipline. The glue that held this diverse force together, shared purpose, faith in command, the structure of rank, melts away like ice in a sudden thaw. Units that marched side by side for months, years even, begin to dissolve. Men desert their colors, thinking only of their own survival. The soldiers' pact, the unspoken agreement to rely on the man next to you, is broken. The esprit de corps, the very soul of the army, evaporates in the freezing air. You watch in horror as the fine machine you built, meticulously calibrated for conquest, transforms into a desperate, every man for himself struggle for bare existence. The lines between officer and private blur in the shared misery, and the power of command wanes with every lost comrade, every empty belly. The strength of an army, you realize with a sickening clarity, isn't found solely in its numbers on paper, or the gleaming bayonets, or the roar of the cannons. Its true power lies in its discipline, its morale, its shared will to fight and endure. When those intangible bonds shatter, when the men stop seeing themselves as a single entity and revert to terrified individuals, the greatest force on earth can become a helpless, scattered mob. You issue orders, you try to rally them, but the words often fall on deaf ears or are lost in the wind and the moans of the dying. The tragedy isn't just the loss of life. It's the loss of the army itself, its identity dissolving into chaos. Ask yourself, what does it take to break not just a man, but the very idea of a collective purpose? This internal collapse, triggered by external failure and environmental devastation, is often the most devastating consequence of all. You built an empire on order and control. Now you watch as disorder and the loss of control claim your greatest instrument. The river glares like shattered ice ahead. Winter has clamped down, a bitter, bone-deep cold that promises death as surely as the converging enemy. To the north, Wittgenstein's Russians press down. To the south, Chichagov blocks the escape route. Behind you, the remnants of the Grande Armée stumble forward, ghosts wrapped in rags against the wind. Ahead, the Berezina River, a treacherous barrier, partially frozen, but not solid enough to cross, too wide and fast to ford. Annihilation is no longer a threat. It is a mathematical certainty closing in from three sides. This is the abyss, the culmination of hubris written across a frozen continent. Yet here, as the vice tightens, something awakens. Not the grand strategist who conquered Europe, but the desperate tactical genius of a cornered predator. Your gaze scans the scene, the despairing faces, the chaotic jumble of men and wagons, the unforgiving river. There is no path forward, only a desperate gamble. The order is given: build bridges, now. At Studieskek, where maps suggest a possible crossing. But the pontoon train, vital tools for this very scenario, was mostly lost or abandoned in the frantic retreat. The responsibility falls upon General Ebley and his few hundred remaining pontooniers, Men who haven't slept or eaten properly in weeks, whose hands are already numb stumps from the cold. Their task is not just to build bridges, but to perform a miracle under fire, standing waist-deep in icy water, battling the current and the encroaching Russians. You orchestrate the impossible defense. Udinot and then Ney are dispatched with the tattered fragments of reliable troops that remain. The Guard, what's left of the veterans, to hold back the Russian pincers while the fragile wooden spans are hammered together. Hours stretch into an eternity of desperate fighting on the eastern bank, a bloody rearguard action where men fight and die, not for glory, but for moments of time, for the chance of others to reach the western side. The bridges rise, flimsy and terrifying, under constant bombardment. A shocking detail often lost in the grand narrative. These engineers worked almost ceaselessly, often plunging into the freezing water to secure supports, without complaint. Many dying from hypothermia or enemy fire right there, their bodies swept away by the current. They are the anonymous heroes of this specific nightmare. As the first troops stream across, a chaotic, desperate rush, the scenes on the eastern bank become apocalyptic. Those who can't cross are trapped. Wagons collapse the bridge, screams pierce the air as thousands fall into the freezing water and drown. Others are overrun by the Russians, captured or slaughtered. It is a scene of unimaginable horror, the price paid for the failure that brought you here. Yet through the chaos, through the sheer force of will and tactical positioning, you manage to hold the trap open just long enough for the Corps, yourself, your marshals, the Imperial Guard, a few thousand survivors, to escape the immediate jaws of complete destruction. It's not a victory. It's a brutal, costly extraction. Ask yourself, was this resilience brilliance, or merely the terrifying effectiveness of a man fighting for his very survival, using the last ounces of loyalty from men who deserved better? What does it say about leadership that its most brilliant tactical displays can occur only in the face of self-inflicted, catastrophic failure? The Grande Armée is no more. It is a ghost in the snow, a few thousand frostbitten, starving men clinging to a semblance of order, led by officers whose faces are masks of despair. Its fighting strength, the muscle and bone forged on a dozen battlefields, has been annihilated by distance, logistics, and the brutal Russian winter. You stand amidst this wreckage, surveying the pitiful remnant, your eagles, ragged flags, battered by the icy wind. A crucial decision presents itself, one that will forever stain your legend in the eyes of many. You must survive. You must return to Paris, the heart of your empire, vulnerable now as whispers of disaster cross the continent. You must raise a new army, secure your throne against the inevitable plots brewing in your absence, and prepare for the backlash from a Europe that smells blood in the water, now emboldened by your catastrophic failure. This journey requires speed, discretion, and the appearance of decisive action, even as the reality is one of desperate damage control. And so, you make the cold, calculated choice. Leaving the remnants under the command of Murat, King of Naples, a flamboyant cavalryman ill-suited for this grim retreat, you prepare to leave. Traveling incognito by sleigh, a solitary figure slipping away under the cloak of night, you begin the long, perilous journey back to the Tuileries. It is a practical decision, undeniably necessary for the very survival of your regime. The throne is the core. Without it, the empire collapses entirely. gathering resources, rebuilding, striking back. These things can only happen from Paris. But for the soldiers left behind, facing a death march through the snow, pursued by Cossacks, ravaged by hunger and disease, it is the ultimate abandonment. They followed your eagles into the frozen hell of Russia, driven by loyalty, ambition, and the sheer force of your will. They endured unimaginable suffering for your glory, your empire, your gamble, and you left them there. The image of the emperor, wrapped in furs, speeding toward safety while his men froze and starved, burned itself into the collective memory of the army and eventually of history. It is a stark illustration of the terrible isolation at the pinnacle of power, where strategic necessity can override loyalty, shared suffering, and the bonds of comradeship forged in fire. The leader must sometimes leave the field to survive, to regroup, to fight another day. But the cost to those left behind is immense, both in lives and in shattered faith. A general shares the fate of his men. An emperor weighs their lives against the survival of the crown. What would you have done, standing in his boots, the fate of an empire hanging in the balance amidst the ruins of your grandest ambition? The great engine of empire, the Grande Armée, is broken. Its bones lie scattered across the endless, indifferent snows of Eastern Europe. You have survived, a ghost returning to a gilded cage in Paris, but the aura of invincibility, that shimmering cloak woven from victory and will, is gone. In its place, a grim, bone-deep knowledge. This catastrophe was a self-inflicted wound. This was the turning point, etched in ice and blood, the moment ambition overran wisdom. When the refusal to tolerate limits, to accept the brutal realities of geography, climate, and a determined foe led to catastrophic loss. You stood at the peak, surveyed the world you had sculpted with fire and steel, and decided it wasn't enough. The whispers of more drowned out the counsel of caution. You pushed too far, underestimated the enemy's vastness and resilience, ignored the undeniable truth of a Russian winter, and allowed pride to cast a fatal shadow over judgment. The principle stands, as stark and unyielding as the frozen earth: unchecked ambition, the fervent belief that sheer will can overcome all obstacles, inevitably leads to overreach. Power divorced from self-awareness, from a humble respect for reality's hard edges, is a fragile thing, destined to shatter against the unyielding wall of consequence. The echoes of that disastrous march reverberate through history, a chilling lesson for any leader, any striver, any human being who has ever felt the intoxicating pull of wanting it all, of believing they are the exception to the rules. The past leans in, its breath cold as the Russian wind, and asks us directly, where are you drawing your line? What is your Niemen, that seemingly insignificant border you cross, marking the point of no return? What seemingly insurmountable force are you underestimating in your own life, your own pursuits? History repeats itself not because it's a predetermined loop, but because the human heart, driven by the same ancient engines of desire and pride, so often forgets the lessons etched in the frozen earth of past failures. Look back at the ice, the snow, the endless white, and remember the 500,000 ghosts who paid the ultimate price for one man's fatal reach. Hear their silent testimony. greatness requires limits, and ignoring them invites ruin. As you yourself would later reflect, perhaps with a hint of the terrible wisdom bought on the plains of Russia. Of all my victories, the one that cost me most dear was that of the Berezina. No, sire, the one that cost you most dear was the decision to cross the Niemen in the first place. The one that cost the most was the inability to say, this far and no further. In the end, the unforgiving snow revealed the fatal flaw, believing the only limit was the horizon of your own desire.